That night began like any other, an ordinary evening at home. John was in the office, as usual, immersed in some financial report. I, in the kitchen, was busy cooking dinner, trying not to think about the countless tasks that still awaited me the next day. It seemed like one of those days when nothing extraordinary would happen. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. We weren't expecting anyone, so I thought it might be a neighbor in need of help, or even a lost delivery man. I went to the door, and when I opened it, my heart almost stopped. There he was, Brad, my brother, standing there with a smile I hadn't seen for years. "Surprise!" he exclaimed, with that twinkle in his eye that always disarmed me. Brad had spent the last few years living abroad, so his arrival was completely unexpected. I couldn't contain my joy and hugged him tightly. "Long time no see, Brad. Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" I asked, still not believing it. "I wanted it to be a surprise," he replied, laughing. We invited Brad in, and the house, which had seemed so ordinary before, was now full of life and nostalgia. We sat in the living room, reminiscing about old times, our childhood adventures, and the games we used to invent. John, always cordial, joined us, although it was clear that he didn't fully understand the depth of our bond. "Remember that time we went up on the roof to see the meteor shower?" Brad asked, laughing. "How could I forget? Mom almost had a seizure when she saw us up there," I replied, laughing along. But then, amid the laughter and memories, our gazes met. It was a brief moment, but charged with a tension I couldn't explain. Brad looked away quickly, but the impact of that moment remained etched in my mind. Something stirred inside me, a feeling I thought I had buried long ago. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just the joy of meeting again after so long, but something told me that that night would be unforgettable, one way or another. When Brad arrived at our house that night, I didn't expect him to show up. I hadn't seen him for years, ever since he moved abroad. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, me, John, and a bottle of wine, maybe watching a movie. The doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, there was Brad, my brother, with that smile that never changed. "Surprise!" he exclaimed, with his arms open. I was paralyzed for a second before throwing myself into his arms. I missed him so much, his presence, his energy. John followed soon after and greeted him warmly. It was as if time had stopped, and we were all together again. "Come in, let's open another bottle of wine," I suggested, trying to hide my excitement. We sat down in the living room and started talking about old times, remembering our childhood, the pranks we used to get up to together. It was heartwarming nostalgia. Brad talked about his adventures abroad, and I felt a mixture of pride and nostalgia. As the evening progressed, our gazes met a few times. There was something different there, a tension that hadn't existed before. It was as if every time our eyes met, a spark ignited something inside me. "Remember that time we got stuck in Grandma's basement?" Brad laughed, looking straight at me. "How could I forget?" I answered, feeling my face flush. The truth is that as he talked about the past, my mind traveled back to those moments when, as a teenager, I began to feel something more than brotherly for him. I always tried to stifle those feelings, to bury them deep down. After all, he was my brother, and that was wrong in so many ways. But there, in that room, with John watching us and laughing at the stories, I felt those feelings resurface with an intensity that frightened me. In that instant, I realized that I never stopped feeling that way about Brad. I just hid it deep down. When we decided it was time for bed, John was the first to say goodbye. He had an early flight in the morning for a business trip. I stayed in the living room with Brad for a few more minutes, pretending to tidy up. But in reality, I just wanted to prolong that moment. "It's good to be back, you know," Brad said, his voice low and soft. "It's good to have you back." "I missed you, Brad," I confessed, feeling my heart racing. He came closer and put his hand on mine. An innocent touch, but one that made my whole body tremble. I lifted my gaze to meet his, and at that moment, I knew that he felt the same way. There was an electricity between us that was impossible to ignore. "I missed you too," he replied, his eyes shining in a way I'd never seen before. That night, I went to bed with my head full of thoughts and my heart heavy. I knew that something had changed between us, something that could no longer be ignored. And, in a way, that terrified and excited me at the same time. The reunion with Brad brought up feelings that I thought had been buried forever, and now I didn't know how to deal with it. As John slept next to me, all I could think about was Brad's touch, the warmth I felt when our gazes met. I was caught between love for my husband and a forbidden passion that threatened to consume everything I knew. The warm reunion and nostalgia for the old days. It was a night like any other. John was on the sofa, distracted by the soccer match on TV. I was in the kitchen, making some tea, when I heard the doorbell ring. I went to answer it, and as soon as I opened the door, there he was, Brad. My heart raced, as if it was about to jump out of my chest. "Brad? I can't believe it's you," I exclaimed, feeling a mixture of surprise and joy. "Hi, little sister," he replied with that smile I always loved, as he wrapped me in a tight hug. It had been years since Brad had moved abroad. Our conversations were limited to sporadic video calls and quick text messages. Having him there, in the flesh, was almost surreal. We missed each other. It was impossible to contain the emotion. John, upon hearing our exchange of words, got up from the sofa and came to the door. "Brad, man, it's been a long time," he said, shaking Brad's hand enthusiastically. "John, good to see you," Brad replied, just as cordially. I invited Brad in, and soon we were all sitting in the living room, chatting and laughing, just like old times. The atmosphere was light and relaxed. We reminisced about our childhood antics, the nights we stayed up late watching movies, and even the most embarrassing moments of our teenage years. It was as if no time had passed. "Do you remember the time we tried to bake that cake and ended up setting the kitchen on fire?" Brad asked with a mischievous grin. "How could I forget? Mom almost killed us," I replied, laughing out loud. John was laughing too, but I could tell he was a little distant, probably with his mind on his work. He had a business trip the next day and was preoccupied with the preparations. It was then that I felt the first sign of tension. Brad and I exchanged a deep look, a look that lasted perhaps a second or two longer than it should have. My heart beat faster. There was something in the air, something I couldn't fully identify, but which was there, latent. "You look great, Brad. Life outside has done you good," I commented, trying to ignore the strange feeling. "And you too, little sister," he replied, looking straight into my eyes. "You're more beautiful than ever." John stood up, interrupting the moment. "I'll get us a beer, Brad. Would you like one too, darling?" "No, thanks, love. I'll just stick to tea," I replied, smiling at him. As soon as John left the room, the silence between Brad and me became almost palpable. I didn't know what to say or do. I was disconcerted by the intensity of that look. Brad seemed to feel the same way, but soon broke the silence. "We need to talk more, you and I. There's a lot to catch up on," he said with a serious tone. "Absolutely," I replied, trying to sound casual, but feeling a growing anxiety. John returned with the beers, and the conversation returned to normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about that look. There was something else there, something that had perhaps been dormant for years, but was now threatening to awaken. The evening continued with laughter and stories, but that underlying tension didn't disappear. When we finally said goodbye to Brad, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. I knew something had changed, but I wasn't ready to face it. "Let's arrange something for tomorrow, after you get home from work, John," I suggested, trying to maintain normality. "Sure, love. It'll be great to spend more time with Brad," he replied, kissing my forehead. As we walked up to the bedroom, I couldn't stop thinking about Brad. The nostalgia of the old days had brought up feelings that I thought were buried. And now, with him back, everything seemed more complicated. I lay down on the bed next to John, but my mind was racing. The reunion with Brad had been warm and full of nostalgia, but there was also something else, something I couldn't define. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning. When our gazes met for the first time that night, I felt something strange in my chest. It was as if a wave of electricity had gone through me. Brad, my brother, had returned after years of living abroad, and despite the joy of the reunion, there was something different in the air. I couldn't explain exactly what, but I knew that this night wouldn't be like the others. He smiled at me, a familiar smile, but one that now seemed charged with something else. "You look beautiful," he said, and I felt my face heat up. The last time we'd seen each other, we were just teenagers. Now we were adults, with lives and responsibilities. But that look, that smile, made me feel as if no time had passed. We talked about everything and nothing at the same time. We reminisced about our childhood games, the nights we spent awake talking about our dreams and fears. But even as we talked about the past, there was a tension in the air, something that hadn't been there before. I noticed it when our gazes met again, and he held eye contact for a second longer than necessary. "Do you remember that time we stayed up all night just talking about life?" asked Brad, with a twinkle in his eye. "Of course I remember," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't think we've ever laughed so much in our lives." Brad laughed, but there was something else in his laugh, something that sent a chill down my spine. "I miss those times," he said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that made me want to cry. I missed it too. I missed the simplicity, the closeness we had. And at that moment, I realized what was different. The closeness was still there, but now it was loaded with something else, something I didn't want to admit to myself. I tried to push these thoughts away, concentrating on the conversation and the laughter. But every time our gazes met, I felt my heart beat faster. It was as if every word, every gesture, was loaded with meaning. And deep down, I knew that Brad felt the same way. "Are you all right?" he asked at one point, with genuine concern in his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, smiling. "Just a bit nostalgic, I guess." "Me too," he replied, and there was a sadness in his voice that made me want to hug him. But I held back. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be able to pull away. The night went on, but the tension between us only increased. Every time he moved, every time our arms accidentally touched, I felt a chill. It was as if something was about to happen, something that would change everything. "I'll get some more wine," I said, standing up abruptly. I needed a moment to breathe, to try to understand what was happening. In the kitchen, I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. But when I came back, I found Brad looking at me in a way he had never done before. "You look different," he said, his voice low and intense. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "I can't explain it," he replied, stepping closer. "But I feel that something has changed between us." My heart raced. "Brad, we're brothers," I said, trying to keep my composure. "I know," he replied, but his gaze said something else. But I can't ignore what I'm feeling. I remained silent, unable to find words, because deep down, I knew I felt the same way. And at that moment, our gazes met again, and the tension between us became unbearable. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that that night would change everything. The evening seemed all too ordinary. John had just left for a business trip, and I was home alone. Brad was on the sofa, with the TV on and some movie on. The tension between us was palpable. Since he came back, something had changed. Our relationship had always been close, but now, there was a different electricity in the air. I sat down next to him, trying to ignore the whirlwind of feelings that were consuming me. "Do you remember that summer we went camping?" I asked, trying to break the silence. Brad smiled, his eyes shining with the memory. "Of course I do. It was one of the best times of my life." "For me too," I replied, feeling my heart race. Our gazes met, and for a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I touched his hand, and the electricity was immediate. "Brad, I began, but he interrupted me. "I feel it too. You know that." His words were a relief and a torment at the same time. We were about to cross a line from which there would be no turning back. He moved closer, and before I knew it, our lips touched. It was an urgent kiss, full of years of repressed feelings. My mind was screaming at me to stop, but my body had already made up its mind. We got up from the sofa, and he led me into the bedroom. The door closed behind us, and all the barriers fell away. Our bodies met in a desperate way, as if we were trying to make up for all the lost time. The passion was overwhelming. Our clothes were thrown to the floor, and we gave ourselves completely to each other. "You're everything I've ever wanted," I whispered, as I felt his body against mine. The night was a mixture of uncontrollable desire and deep affection. Every touch, every kiss, felt like an explosion of feelings that we had repressed for so long. He looked at me with an intensity I had never seen before, and this only increased my desire for him. When we finally stopped, exhausted and satisfied, guilt began to creep in. I looked at Brad and saw the same expression on his face. "What have we done?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "Something we can't undo," he replied, pulling me closer. "But I don't regret it." It was dawn, and the sunlight coming through the window seemed cruel in its clarity. Reality was beginning to set in, and with it, guilt. I stood up, trying to avoid his gaze. "We need to talk about this." "I know," he replied with a sigh. "But right now, I just want to enjoy this moment with you." I lay down next to him again, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to forget the world outside. However, I knew that the real battle was yet to come. That night changed everything. The unbridled passion that had consumed us had left deep scars, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same. But at that moment, with Brad by my side, guilt mixed strangely with ecstasy, creating a sensation I had never experienced before. The sun had barely risen when I woke up, the timid rays invading the room through the ajar window. Last night was still vivid in my memory. Every touch, every sigh, every look. I got up slowly, trying not to make a sound, but the tension in my body made me clumsy. Brad was still asleep next to me, breathing heavily and quietly. What we had done seemed like a dream I didn't want to wake up from, but reality was there, ready to hit me. I thought about how difficult it would be to face it in the light of day, without the darkness to hide the intensity of what we had experienced. I needed to pull myself together, to act normally. John would be calling soon, and I couldn't let him see anything wrong with my voice. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, took a deep breath, and returned to the bedroom. Brad began to stir, slowly opening his eyes. When our gazes met, I felt a mixture of nervousness and complicity. "Good morning," I whispered, trying to smile. "Good morning," he replied, his voice hoarse, but with a tone of affection that made me melt inside. The tension was palpable. We needed to act normally. But how? How, after everything that had happened? Brad got up, got dressed in silence, and the two of us went down to the kitchen. I was preparing a coffee when the phone rang. It was John. My heart raced, and Brad gave me a supportive look. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hi, my love. How are you?" John asked, his voice full of affection. "I'm fine. How are you?" "How's the trip?" I asked, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "Everything's fine here. I just wanted to hear your voice. How are things at home?" He continued, nonchalantly. "Everything's normal. Brad's here, remember?" I said, trying to sound casual. "Oh yes. Give him a hug. I'm glad he's there to keep you company. I love you, see?" "I love you too, John," I replied, the weight of guilt crushing my chest. I hung up the phone and looked at Brad. He came closer, put his hand on my shoulder and whispered, "It's going to be okay." I wanted to believe him. We had to act naturally, but the exchange of complicit glances between us said it all. There was a shared secret, an invisible bond that united us more than ever. "I have to go," Brad said, breaking the silence. "I have some appointments today." "Of course," I replied, trying to hide the sadness in my voice. I walked him to the door, and, before I left, he stopped, looking deep into my eyes. "It doesn't end here, you know," he said, his voice full of determination. "I know," I replied, holding back tears. He pulled me into one last hug, and I felt his scent, his presence, imprinting itself on my mind. When the door closed, the house seemed emptier than ever. Guilt and ecstasy mixed inside me, creating a storm of emotions that I didn't know how to control. The day passed slowly, and every minute without Brad seemed like an eternity. I tried to occupy myself with mundane tasks, but my mind kept returning to him, to us. The silent promise that it wouldn't end there was the only thing keeping me sane, but it was also the source of all my anguish. When night came, I lay in bed, alone, and let the tears roll down. I was caught between two worlds, two loves, two realities. And as hard as it was, I knew I couldn't go back. Brad and I had crossed a line, and there was no undoing what had been done. The betrayal was present, alive, pulsating, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I closed my eyes, trying to find some relief in sleep, but the memory of the unforgettable night with Brad was stronger. I was torn, broken, but at the same time, I felt a strange sense of completeness, as if somehow this was what I had always wanted, what I had always needed. And despite everything, I knew that the story between us had only just begun, and so I plunged into the darkness of my room, hoping that the new day would bring some clarity, some answer. But deep down, I knew that the only certainty I had was that Brad and I were destined to continue, no matter what the cost. Getting back into the routine after that night with Brad was harder than I'd imagined. Every time I looked at John, I felt a pang of guilt in my chest. But along with the guilt came an uncontrollable desire for Brad. I tried to concentrate on my day-to-day tasks, but my thoughts always returned to the night we spent together. Brad and I exchanged text messages constantly. At first, it was just a few words, but soon they became bolder and bolder. "I can't stop thinking about you," Brad wrote one morning. "Me too," I replied, my heart racing. "When are we going to see each other again?" "Soon. I need to feel you again," he replied. Brad's messages were like a drug. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. And every time John hugged or kissed me, the guilt became unbearable. "Are you all right?" John asked one evening while we were having dinner. "Yeah, I'm just a bit tired," I lied, forcing a smile. It was hard to look at John and lie. But the need to be with Brad was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. So Brad and I decided to meet at a cafe, far from home, to discuss what we had done and what we would do from then on. I was nervous as I entered the cafe. Brad was already there, sitting at a table in the corner, wearing sunglasses and a cap, trying not to be recognized. I sat down opposite him, my heart beating wildly. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know," he replied, taking off his glasses and looking me straight in the eye. "But before anything else, I need to know if you regret it." "I don't regret anything," I replied without hesitation. "But I'm scared, afraid of getting caught, afraid of hurting John." Brad held my hand under the table. "I'm scared too, but I can't stay away from you." "So what are we going to do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We'll be careful. No one has to know. We can keep seeing each other, but we have to be discreet," he said, squeezing my hand. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and excitement. "I need to tell you something," I said hesitantly. "John is suspicious. He asked if everything was all right." Brad frowned. "We need to be more careful then. We can't let him find out." I know, I replied, trying not to panic. "But I don't know how long I can lie to him. The guilt is killing me." Brad sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I feel the guilt too, but I can't stop wanting you." "So, are we going to continue?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "But we need to be smart about it. We're going to meet in places where no one can see us. We need to be discreet." I agreed, feeling a weight come off my shoulders. "Let's make this work." "We will," Brad said, holding my face and kissing me softly. "I promise." We left the cafe with the promise to continue our clandestine encounters, but with the determination to be more careful. Going home and facing John was difficult, but I kept up the facade of a happy marriage. Every time John hugged me, I felt a twinge of guilt, but the desire for Brad always spoke louder. The text messages continued, getting bolder and bolder, fueling the forbidden fire between us. And despite the guilt and fear, I knew there was no turning back. Brad was like an addiction I couldn't get rid of, and every secret meeting only increased my need to be with him. Our next meeting was already planned, and the excitement of that forbidden moment consumed me. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't stop. And so the betrayal continued, alive and kicking, with no end in sight. We decided to continue our clandestine encounters. If before there had been an internal battle within me, now I had given myself over completely to this forbidden passion. Each encounter with Brad was like a flame that was ignited, burning, consuming, but never going out. The first night we went to a motel, the excitement of the forbidden was palpable. The place was discreet, tucked away on a quiet street. When I entered the room, I felt my heart racing. Brad closed the door behind us and pulled me close, his eyes shining with a mixture of desire and nervousness. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and husky, almost a whisper. I just nodded, unable to form words. He kissed me with an intensity that made my whole body tremble. It was as if that moment was the culmination of everything we had repressed for so long. The overwhelming passion was renewed with every encounter. Every touch, every kiss, every moment together was more intense than the last. I felt alive in a way I had never felt before. Brad knew exactly how to touch me, how to make me feel wanted and loved. He was everything I had ever wanted, but had never known how to admit. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered in my ear as we lay on the bed, our bodies entwined. "Me too, Brad. It's like you're always with me, in every thought, in every breath," I replied, my voice charged with emotion. But along with the passion came the constant fear of being discovered. Every time we went out together, every time we met, there was a risk. The risk of someone seeing us, of someone discovering our secret. This fear, however, only seemed to increase the excitement. It was as if the danger fueled our relationship, made everything even more intense. "What if someone finds out?" I asked one evening, as we were getting dressed after another date. "What if John finds out?" Brad stopped and looked me in the eye, his face serious. "I'm not going to let that happen. Let's be careful. I don't want to lose you." I wanted to believe him, but the fear was real, palpable. Even so, I couldn't stop. Every goodbye was a silent promise that it wouldn't end there, that we would meet again, that we would continue to indulge in this forbidden passion. With each meeting, guilt grew inside me. But along with it, so did the desire, the need to be with Brad. I knew I was in danger, that I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stay away. Brad was like a drug, something I needed, something that made me feel alive. The fear of being discovered was always there, but at the same time, that's what made it all the more intense. Every encounter was a challenge, a risk, but also an opportunity to experience something I had never experienced before. I was torn between fear and desire, between guilt and passion. But deep down, I knew I couldn't stop. These secret meetings became my escape, my way of escaping reality, of living something that seemed so unreal, so distant, but at the same time, so true. I was trapped in a cycle of desire and guilt, but I couldn't find a way out. And maybe, deep down, I didn't even want to get out. The internal struggle between my feelings for Brad and my commitment to John was a constant whirlwind inside me. At night, when John was sleeping next to me, I could hardly sleep a wink. I stared at the ceiling, reliving every touch, every kiss, every moment that Brad and I had shared. I wondered how it had come to this. How could I have let things get out of hand like this? But the mere memory of Brad's smile, of the way he looked at me, made my heart race in a way I hadn't felt in a long time with John. One of those sleepless nights, I decided to get out of bed. I went into the kitchen, made some tea, and sat down at the table. That's when I heard light footsteps behind me. It was Brad. He was standing in the doorway, watching me. "Can't sleep?" he asked in a soft voice. I shook my head. "What about you?" "Not either," he replied, coming closer and sitting down in front of me. "I've been thinking about us a lot." "Me too," I admitted, my voice almost a whisper. "But I don't know what to do, Brad. John is my husband. I love him, but what I feel for you is different." He held my hand over the table. "I know. I'm going through the same thing. But I can't stay away from you. When I'm close to you, everything makes sense." I took a deep breath, feeling the electricity that always ran through my body when Brad touched me. "This is so wrong, Brad. How can we go on like this?" "I don't know, but I don't want to lose you again," he said, squeezing my hand. I can't. I didn't know what to say. Confusion and guilt consumed me, but at the same time, Brad's presence gave me a sense of completeness that I hadn't felt for years. He stood up, walked around the table, and pulled me into a tight hug. I melted into his arms, feeling a mixture of comfort and despair. "Let's find out together, okay?" He whispered in my ear. "I'm here. I always will be." The next few days were a real emotional hell. I found myself thinking about Brad all the time, even when I was with John. And every time my phone vibrated with a message from Brad, my heart leapt. Our conversations became more frequent and bolder. I felt torn between guilt and euphoria. One night, after John had gone to bed, I received a message from Brad. "I'm thinking about you. I can't stop thinking about the last time we saw each other." I typed a quick reply. "Me too. It's killing me inside." He replied almost immediately, "We need to talk. Tomorrow at the cafe around the corner, after work." I agreed, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. The next day, I went to work trying to act normally, but my mind was elsewhere. When the time finally came for us to meet, my heart was racing. Brad was already there when I arrived. He stood up and gave me a tight hug, as if he was afraid I was going to disappear. We sat down in a more private corner of the cafe, away from prying eyes. "We need to talk about what we're doing, Brad," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "This can't go on like this. I'm married. You're my brother. It's a disaster waiting to happen. I know, but I can't stay away from you," he replied, the pain evident in his eyes. "I've tried, but I can't. When I'm with you, I feel alive." "But what about John?" I asked, feeling tears gathering in my eyes. "He doesn't deserve this." Brad held my hands, his eyes fixed on mine. "I know, and it kills me too. But what we have is real. We can't just ignore it." We were silent for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew he was right. Our feelings for each other were undeniable, but guilt and betrayal were always lurking. "So what do we do?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. "Let's take it slow. We don't have to decide everything now. Let's see where it takes us," he suggested, trying to comfort me. I nodded, even though I knew the situation was far from resolved. The internal battle continued, but at least I wasn't alone. And as Brad held my hands, promising that we would be in this together, I felt a small thread of hope that somehow we would find a way out. I woke up that morning with a strange feeling of anticipation in my chest. It was already clear to me that this betrayal with Brad wasn't just a slip-up. I knew that something deeper was going on between us, something I couldn't control. Brad and I exchanged secret messages throughout the day, arranging the details of our next date. Adrenaline coursed through my body with every word typed. "Meet me at 8 p.m. at our usual place," he suggested. "Yes, I'll be there," I replied, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. John didn't suspect a thing. He was busy with work and always believed in the facade of our happy marriage. "Love, are you all right?" he asked, with a worried look on his face. "Yes, I'm just a bit tired," I lied, smiling at him. It was painful to lie, but the need to be with Brad was stronger than the guilt. In the evening, I dressed up carefully, choosing a dress that I knew Brad loved. When I arrived at the cafe where we always met, he was already there, waiting for me with a smile that made my heart soar. "You look beautiful," he said, taking my hand. I felt the electricity between us again, a spark that never went away. We sat at a table in the corner, where we could talk without being noticed. "We need to be more careful," said Brad, looking around. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you," I confessed, my voice low and shaky. "I can't either," he replied, squeezing my hand tightly. We knew we were playing with fire, but the attraction was irresistible. After breakfast, we went to a discreet motel, where we could give ourselves to each other without fear of being discovered. The passion between us was overwhelming. Every touch, every kiss, fueled the fire burning inside us. "You're everything I've ever wanted," I whispered as our bodies joined. "And you're everything to me," he replied, his eyes burning with desire. It was hard to ignore the guilt rising in my chest, but at that moment, the pleasure and connection I felt with Brad were stronger. We spent the night together, surrendered to the intensity of our forbidden love. At dawn, reality returned like a bucket of cold water, but we couldn't stop. The next day, the difficulty of facing Brad in daylight was palpable. He came to my house for a family lunch, and I had to act as if nothing was happening. When John called from his trip, I tried to sound as normal as possible. "Hi, love. How are things?" he asked. "Everything's fine here. We all miss you," I lied, trying not to let my voice shake. During lunch, Brad and I exchanged complicit glances, a silent secret that we shared. The tension was almost unbearable, but exciting at the same time. When he said goodbye, I felt a tightness in my chest, knowing that it wouldn't end there. "See you then," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. "See you," I replied, trying to hide the emotion in my voice. We got back to our routine, but it was getting harder and harder to hide my feelings for Brad. The text messages got bolder every day, and the guilt grew as I looked at John. "You've been acting strange lately," he commented one night. "I'm just tired, that's all," I lied again, feeling a heaviness in my heart. Brad and I would meet in cafes, motels, anywhere we could be together without being discovered. Each encounter was a mixture of passion and fear, a dangerous game that we knew couldn't go on forever. But the betrayal was still very much alive, and I knew there was no end in sight. The acceptance that it would become a constant part of our lives was both frightening and exciting. We didn't know where it would lead, but we were willing to find out, together.